Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vectra Bank's President and CEO, Bruce Alexander.
Thank you. Good morning. We're so delighted to have everybody here today. I want to welcome you to our 30th annual Economic Forecast Breakfast. I'm sorry that it's cold out, but at least we didn't make you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning for our early morning tradition. So you'll have to let us know whether you prefer lunch or breakfast, but we're just so delighted to have everybody here in person. For 30 years now, we have gathered to review the previous year and provide context for what our experts will tell us about the year ahead. While the last couple of years we've been in a virtual environment with our interactions and events being on Teams or Zoom calls, I find it so refreshing to today once again be together in person and share the opportunity to network and connect and collaborate on a personal level. I don't know about you, but I've really missed that, and so to see you all here is just delightful. I also want to welcome and acknowledge those who continue to join us virtually. As you know, we have offices across the state of Colorado, so we'll have hundreds of clients and participants from around the state joining us on our webcast today. I appreciate the opportunity to share our event with all of you from our statewide audience. Over the past 30 years, we've seen multiple recessions, bull and bear markets, regulatory and legislative changes, roller coaster rides in politics and the stock market, and we've repeated lessons in ethics, diversity, and inclusion. We've seen high highs and low lows, as business leaders, many of us still feel the impact of the pandemic, despite our best efforts to strengthen our economy and to return to a more stable and consistent environment. Are we too cautious in our approach to the future? What are we to make of what we've experienced? How do we incorporate what we've learned? Now more than ever, it makes sense to pause and reflect on where we are, what's ahead, and what our next steps should be. From our speakers today, you will learn where we are in the current economic cycle. You will hear about the trends in the core drivers of our economy and what to watch for in the future. As you listen to our presenters this morning, I encourage you to identify the lessons you can incorporate into your own business or your own organization. The winners in this next year will be those who seek to understand the economy and commit to reacting in a way that is beneficial with their own organization. We've left time, as always, at the end of our event to give you access to these experts with questions, and certainly they're willing to stay around afterwards if you don't get to ask your question at the podium. And anytime you can submit your question using the QR code that is printed on the centerpieces in front of you. We'd also appreciate your comments or questions via Twitter at #VectraForecast. To our webcast participants, you can submit your question right on the webcast homepage. I'm really excited about our first speaker today, Elizabeth Garner. Elizabeth is the Colorado State Demographer with the Department of Local Affairs, an agency focused on strengthening the capacity of Colorado's communities and local governments. Elizabeth has over 25 years of experience analyzing population estimates and economic trends throughout Colorado. And her current areas of research include aging in Colorado, characteristics of migration, and poverty. She is one of the most interesting people I know, one of my favorite speakers. I'm delighted that she can join us today. Elizabeth?
Good afternoon. I have actually never had, I don't think, a music intro before, so that's pretty sweet. Thanks for inviting me to be part of your program today, and hopefully what I'm going to do is share with you some interesting information about what we're seeing in terms of population trends and actually why this matters when we're looking at the economy and how we're moving forward. Some of the biggest trends to take away that we really need to embrace is the fact that Colorado, as well as the country, is slowing down in population growth. And I know you probably don't believe me, especially if you're in the Denver metro area or if you're in the North Front Range, you see all the cranes and all of the building. But I will tell you, we're seeing this slowdown primarily because we're seeing a slowing in births and an increasing in deaths. We're also seeing a slowing in net migration as well as mobility across the country. We're also seeing concentrated growth in the Front Range. And a lot of times people are like, where are all of these people coming from? And I'm like, well, listen, that's also where we're seeing 95% of our job growth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that connection between job growth and population growth. And aging. Who is a day older today than yesterday? Thank goodness, right? Because the alternative isn't as positive, but it impacts everything, and I will tell you definitely it's related to the labor force and job growth and housing. Lastly, but not least, is the fact that we're also becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, especially at our youngest ages. So I know I'm breaking every rule of PowerPoint etiquette by putting this amount of information on one slide. Totally understand and I embrace it, but I want you guys to understand where things are. So we are slowing. In the nation, we're slowing. In the country, over the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, we saw that the US grew at its second slowest rate ever. Second slowest to the Great Depression in the 1930s. Yes, still a growth of 22 million people, an increase of 7.4%, but a slow decade. Between 2020 and 2021, yes, a weird year, we had the slowest growth rate ever in the United States. An increase of 0.1%, 520,000 people, and 17 states lost population. This last year, between 21 and 22, a little bit more growth that year, this last year, a 0.4% increase, but 19 states lost population. So this is something that we have to deal with. If the United States is slowing down, this will have an impact on Colorado. You can see the numbers for Colorado over the decade, an increase of 14%, 745,000. The last year, though, between 2020 and 2021, our growth rate fell to a 0.5% and an increase of 26,000 people. If you think about that, our average over the last decade was 74,000 annually, fell to 26,000. And this last year, between 21 and 22, about the same level, 27,000, an increase of 0.5%. So this is important to see that we are slowing in total numbers and relative to other states. The question is, why? If we look over the decade and we see where Colorado grew, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue are counties where we saw a decline in population over the decade. 95% of our growth was in the Front Range, contrary to historical patterns, which it was closer to 78%. So we have departed from our average that we've seen historically. So what drives population change? There's 3 easy pieces. It's not rocket science what I do. Births, deaths, and net migration. What you see on this chart, the blue component, is what we call natural increase. It's the births minus the deaths. We reached a peak level in 2007, and we've been slowing on that level ever since. Why? Because we're seeing fewer births and increasing deaths. Increasing deaths, not just COVID deaths, but also because there's a larger share of our population in age groups with higher death rates. So that's putting some downward pressure. I don't think we'll ever see that level of natural increase ever as high as we saw in 2008 again. The red piece is net migration, the ins minus the outs. And again, this chart starts in 1970, and you can kind of see these business patterns in this whole graphic. You can see where the lovely 80s, anybody remember the lovely 80s? We had 5 years of net out migration, savings in loan bust, oil and gas bust, but that set us up for the 90s and earned into the early 2000s where we actually saw growth over 100,000 7 different times. But I will tell you that the last time we increased by over 100,000 was in 2001. So when you hear the media, anybody media out there? Take note. This is not exponential growth. This is not people flocking to the state. So it's important that we don't say that if it's not happening. What we've actually been seeing is very steady growth, and over the past 7 years, a slowdown in growth. A slowdown in growth pre-pandemic, and that's important to note. I mentioned the fact that we're seeing this slowing in births, and we've heard it on the news a lot recently, especially having to do with the closure of a lot of schools in K-12. But what we've seen, again, is this slowing in births. We had our peak birth in 2007. We're down about 8,000 fewer births per year in Colorado than we had in 2007 currently. In the United States, we're down about 525,000 fewer births per year than what we saw in our peak in 2007. What has that led to? It has led to an absolute decline in the under 18 population over the last decade. All of the red, orange, peach states are states that had an increase in the under 18 population. All of the shades of blue are states that did not. Yeah, you should be taking a gasp because let's say you work in higher ed. Who are some of the largest donor states to our public higher ed system in Colorado? Oh yes, California, Illinois, Northeast. This is a concern. We were already having challenges with higher ed in terms of kids in enrollment. Now if we've got some of our largest donor states with an absolute decline, yeah, there's a big uncertainty. What about labor force? We think it's tight now, just wait. Who are also some of our largest donor states for our labor force? California, Midwest, Northeast. And talk about competition. These states know that they are competing for the best and the brightest. They're already seeing an absolute decline. We have heard of states competing against Colorado just for higher ed. We know in Vermont, they are offering matching tuition. If you get into CU Boulder, you can go to UVM, same amount. I will be honest with you, both of my kids were attracted out of state for higher ed and paid less than they would have at CU out of state. And what happens when they leave? They don't come back. They meet someone, they fall in love, and I've lost them. It's not funny. So what does this look like in Colorado? Red, orange, yellow, positive. All of the shades of blue are counties that had an absolute decline in the under 18 population over the decade. Our under 18 population increased by 38,000 of the 744,000. Only 5% of our growth was in the under 18. Anybody from Weld County? That county actually represented 45% of our growth in our under 18 population. So, we're looking for kids in the future, we're looking for a future labor force, make nice with Weld County, because that's where all of the kids are. What about the year between 2020 and 2021? We know that it was a weird year, we know that everything slowed down. Red, orange, yellow, positive growth, all of the shades of blue decline. Yes, Denver, decline in population. Jefferson County, Boulder County, absolute decline in population. We've seen the Eastern Plains, we see the Western Slope, especially the Northwest, some of our mountain counties as well. So important to see how these dynamics are starting to take place. So I've talked about births and deaths. The other piece I haven't talked about is net migration, and who do we typically attract to Colorado? We attract youngins. This is an age distribution of our migrants to Colorado. That peak is kind of in that 22 to 37-year-old. If you're following this presentation and this conversation, what I said was that we had our peak birth in 2007. How old are they now? They're 15. 5 to 7 years from now, they are going to be entering into that prime migration age group. After that, we expect an absolute decline. So 2020 to 2030, we might be all right. 2030 forward, absolute decline potential in that group of folks that we typically migrate to Colorado. So something for us to be thinking about and planning for. Who do we attract and retain, and who do we trade people with across the country? The different red shaded states, red, orange, yellow, are our largest donor states. All of the shades of blue are states that we lose people to. And like I mentioned before, California, Midwest, Northeast, largest donor areas, also areas experiencing declines in population and declines in that under 18. So hopefully what you're taking away from this is, man, we thought labor force was tight today. I wonder what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's what you all should be thinking about, is really how do we think about our labor force differently? We also know that our labor force is really connected to job growth and net migration. And so over time, we have seen this relationship. As we grow more jobs, we tend to grow and need more population. The blue bars are job growth. The red line is net migration. And you can see when we grow jobs, we tend to need people, so we migrate more. When we don't when we don't have as much job growth, we don't migrate as many. This seems pretty obvious, intuitive, right? But can I tell you, right now, everyone is like, Elizabeth, I don't like people. And I'm like, why don't you like people? I mean, imagine, that's my job. And they're like, they're on our roads, they're in our houses, they're on the ski slope. Yeah, I just don't like them. I'm like, okay, but what do you think about jobs? And they're like, you know what? Jobs are awesome. They're the best thing out there. We need more jobs. I'm like, all right, so you're a fan of jobs, but you hate people? But a job is a person, and a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. So I am going to invite all of you to help Colorado have that conversation that if we're going to be positive on job growth and positive on economic growth, that we also need to have a more positive and important conversation about housing, because they come together, jobs and population, and even worse is the fact that we're aging. And I'll get into that in a minute. I won't talk too much about jobs because we've got two other fantastic women that are going to be talking about the economy. But the point is, jobs are back. Jobs are back in Colorado. We are back above pre-COVID level of employment. We're about 127% recovered compared to the country that's at about 108% recovered. So we are back, but we know that it's not every industry, and we know that it's not every county. If we look across the state and we just compare quarter 2, 2019 to quarter 2, 2022, red, orange, yellow are the counties that are back to pre-COVID levels of employment. All of the shades of blue are not. So we definitely know that we still have work to do, or at least work to think about, in a lot of the areas that are not back to pre-COVID levels of employment. And some of that might be a conversation about housing and our concerns and our issues with housing in Colorado. Again, so many people are like, yeah, no, it's all of these people flocking to the state that are creating the problem for housing. And I'm like, all right, we've had this conversation. People aren't flocking. There is no exponential growth. So why are we having this discussion? I'm like, really, the problem is the fact that we stopped building. The orange bars are housing unit growth. The black line is household formation. Pre-COVID, pre-Great Recession, we were building 40 to 50,000 housing units a year. So when people are like, oh, but look at all of those cranes and all that building, I'm like, you know what it is? It's short-term memory loss. This is what we used to do. But for 10 years, we took a hiatus on building. And that has created this conflict between supply and demand of housing for people, because we kept growing steady, not flocking, steady. We stopped building. But if you look at the far right end of this chart, you will see that housing unit growth is back on track. We're back above that 40,000-ish level of new housing units coming online. Over the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, we built 126,000 fewer units than we did the previous decade. Because of that now, lack of supply and continued demand, we have the 6th highest home price, the 4th highest median rent, yet only the 10th highest median household income. We know now why people are struggling, right, in the state, because we've had this challenge. As I mentioned before, we're back on permits. They're coming back in terms of levels, and they've actually been coming back for the last 6 to 7 years. We just need to make up that kind of excess demand that we've had historically. We know that there's a lot of different factors impacting housing supply and demand, and I'm not going to go onto this list. I'm like seeing if the list was still up there. It's like it disappeared for a second. I'm like, they're not going to be able to see it. But we know in terms of supply that we weren't building, that it is a slow industry to start and stop, that there's some public will concerns about building, that we do have concerns about water and infrastructure. But we're back. We're getting closer to where that level of supply that we need. On the demand side, remember, if you guys are going to go after job growth, which I'm kind of growth agnostic, there's benefits and drawbacks from everything. If you're going to go back to growth, you need to make sure that we've got housing for those people. We also know that there's aging, which I'll get into in a second. Millennials are entering home buying and second home buying. Gen Z are getting into housing as well. We know that we have more money available. We also know that there's this weird investor impact as well, where we've got a lot of institutional investors coming in and buying up large swaths of single-family homes and holding them vacant, which is not helping our supply of housing either. So why do I think age is so important? Why I want to mention age as I finish up? It impacts everything we do, right? Think about how you've bought in different goods and services over your time. What you do as a 20-year-old, 40-year-old, 60-year-old, 80-year-old changes over time, and thank God, right? I've got 2 20-year-olds, and I am really hoping they change their preferences over time, right? But you gotta, in order to get to 30, you gotta be 20, and so there's still hope out there. I'm not anti-20, they're interesting, right? But it impacts, your age impacts what you buy, the housing, how you participate in the labor force, what kind of service demands you need. And so it's always important to know your age distribution. And this is ours. This is what Colorado looks like by single year of age, broken down by generation. The peak red is kind of 29 years old. The red are our millennials, the green are Gen X, the purple are our baby boomers, and the light blue on the far right side our silent generation, and then on the left-hand side, the darker blue is our Gen Z, and then we've got our Gen Alpha. You can see that slowdown on those youngins. There's fewer 0-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds. So we can see that. We can also see the number of boomers aging into the 65 plus and potential retirement. Over this decade, we're forecasting declines in the under 18 population. I know, we think that school districts have their work cut out for them. Make those tough choices. Very flat growth on the 20 to 24, the 18 to 24-year-olds. Some growth in the 25 to 44, if we can migrate them here, and if there's housing for them. 45 to 64, pretty flat, but look at the 65 plus. We're forecast to increase in the state as a whole by over about 600,000, 630,000. Our 65 plus is forecast to increase by 310,000. So of all of our growth that we complain about, almost half of it is our 65 plus. And people ask me, they're like, God, Elizabeth, where are they coming from? I'm like, oh no, my friend, look in a mirror. It is us. And I'll be honest with you, I am going to be one of those. I am hopefully going to be aging into that 65 plus. People say, God, why do you hope that? And I'm like, really? I mean, the alternative you don't hope for. I'm going to be aging out of the labor force, God willing, and Paris stays solvent. Do you think I'm going to leave my house? Absolutely not. The next state demographer is not going to live there. We've got 400,000 to 500,000 of people like me over this decade that are going to leave the labor force. And majority aren't going to leave the state. So our demand for housing will continue to change simply based on our age dynamic. We can also look at how it will affect our working age population, red, orange, yellow, positive. All of the shades of blue decline in our working age population over the next decade. So this is serious. This is long run. This is something that we need to be thinking about. I won't read to you all of these different implications from aging, but know that I am going to retire, but I'm going to spend my money here. So I am going to create a job just by retiring and spending my money in Colorado. And guess where I'm going to spend it? Accommodations, food service, leisure and hospitality, and probably healthcare. We can plan ahead for people like me, and the kinds of jobs I'm going to create, and the wages that they pay, and the type of housing that we know that they can afford. So stuff for us to be thinking about. We know that it's going to impact our labor force, and we know it's going to impact housing because like my house provided a service to 4 people. Same house only provides a service now to 2 people. If you're like my mom, she's still in the house I grew up in, only providing service to 1 person. It used to provide to 5. This is what we're doing in the state. Last brief thing I'm going to mention is the fact that we're becoming racially and ethnically diverse, but it's happening at our youngest ages. If we look at our entire population, or the population 18 and older, about 60% of our growth over the last decade was in our people of color, about 40% in our white non-Hispanic. If we look at our under 18 population, 100% of our growth was in our people of color. An absolute decline in our white non-Hispanic under the age of 18. What does that leave us with? That leaves us with an interesting dynamic in terms of age. This shows our share of the people of color by age group. We can look at our under 18 or even under 24, over 40% people of color. Compared to people that will be aging out of the labor force, much lower share people of color. So thinking strategically, how do we make sure that we're marketing? How do we make sure that we're attracting, training all of our new labor force and population, not only entering the labor force, but also entering different dynamics in terms of buying? So to tie things up, biggest takeaways. The fact is we are growing, but at a slower rate. So that kind of momentum behind our population growth is slowing down. And this will have long-run impacts on our labor force. It will have also, we've got this, and hopefully the other women will talk about, the impact of hybrid and remote. And is that a benefit or a drawback? Important to know that our fastest growth is our 65-plus population. Any of you out there market or specifically are looking at products and services for the 65-plus? No one? Okay, good, a couple. Thank goodness. I was going to say, oh, bad move. This is our fastest growing age group. Thinking about them is going to be strategic. Thinking about how this also impacts housing will be critical. We're forecast to continue to grow. Colorado is the blue bar, the United States is the red line. But both the US and Colorado forecast to slow down in that growth over time. We're forecast to increase by about 600,000 over this next decade, where the starred one is this decade, but slowing in the following decades. If we're looking at the growth, red, orange, yellow, positive, shades of blue decline, concentrated in the Front Range, again, unless something changes. So forecast to increase from 5.7 million to 7.5 million, 1.8 million over those 30 years. Yes, there's a ton of uncertainties. There always are. I think some of the biggest ones really are international migration, water, housing, in terms of where does Colorado fit into this picture. So with that, I want to thank all of you for having me here today and hope you have a wonderful day and looking forward to the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
So I don't know how many demographers you know, but she's pretty damn cool, isn't she? You kind of scared the hell out of me, though. I'm not sure what we're going to do for staff and how we're going to accommodate and adjust our marketing plans, but really important things for all of us to think about in all phases of our lives. So our next speaker is Patty Silverstein. Patty is the president of Development Research Partners and currently serves as the consulting chief economist for the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation and the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. Vectra is a proud member of the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, and one of the valuable resources EDC provides its investors is its regular access to customized research and economic data. Much of that data is refined and shared annually by Patty, and we are so honored to have her with us today. And those of you who have been with us for a long time, our 30 years, I think Patty has been here for at least a couple decades, and she's just one of our favorite speakers. I think you're really going to enjoy her today. Patty?
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. So how many marathon runners do we have out here? Anybody? Anybody? God bless you if you are. But those of us here in Colorado, you know, we are very physically active, right? In fact, 83% of the adults here in the state participate in some type of physical activity. And no matter what type of activity you tend to participate in, there's this whole idea of maintaining the perfect pace, right? You want to make sure that you're going at the speed that will allow you to continue without getting tired. I want to talk about the perfect pace for our economy here. And now, you know, the economy doesn't get tired. I get that, you know, so we don't have to maintain the pace because of that. But we do need to maintain a pace because there are times when we overheat, or there are times when we go into kind of a stagnation. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about what is the perfect pace for growth here in the Metro Denver region. So we economists, we can look at all sorts of historical data trying to find the best periods of time that really have set the pace for our economic growth. And I would suggest that this 2010 to 2019 period, this was the longest expansion in U.S. history. This was a period of time when those of us from Metro Denver and indeed throughout the state of Colorado, we were getting accolades every single day practically, some type of ranking where we were coming out on top. So I would suggest that if we can kind of compare ourselves to what that pace was in 2010, 2019, that would give us a little bit of view as to where perhaps we should be. So starting just kind of the basic here in terms of real GDP, you know, gross domestic product, again, the broadest measure of economic activity. This looks at this chart and in charts that are going to follow, then the red line reflects that 10-year trend, that 2010 to 2019, that was, again, that perfect period, that perfect pace, versus the orange lines will reflect a 20-year trend. Let's just throw in a couple more recessions into the numbers just to see what happens. I mean, if we go back that prior 10 years, so 2000 to 2019, you know, what are we looking at? How does that change the situation? And then the green line is going to be where we have been, both at actual data as well as our forecast data as we look on forward there. So in general, we have seen then that the perfect pace for the U.S. economy is going to be somewhere around that 2.1, 2.3% type of increase in GDP. Our expectation is that we will be tracking a little bit below that in 2023. But, we've had these whole wild swings up and down. And I will just put out there right now, I am not calling for recession. Yes, we are looking at some type of slowdown, but again, I think that we are still going to continue to see some type of expansion within our whole economic system. So that sets kind of our whole baseline then. Now I'm going to talk about then what we're seeing in terms of our employment base, in terms of commercial real estate, in terms of our consumers, and then we'll wrap it up with residential real estate because, as has always been the case, that's just the crazy one to kind of track what's happened. So turning first of all to labor force and employment, persistence is definitely going to be key here, and we need to think about employment in terms of our long-term trends these days. So first of all across the state of Colorado, we are seeing growth rates of near 3% or better in 2022. That's huge. The U.S. growing at 4%, Colorado growing at 4.4%. All of our metropolitan statistical areas, there are 7 of them in the state. These are our urbanized regions throughout the state. They represent 17 of our 64 counties. Again, all of them growing at very, very solid paces. Indeed, if we were to kind of strip down the data, we saw that Colorado recovered all of those jobs that had been lost due to COVID, as Elizabeth had mentioned there. We recovered all of those jobs as of February 2022. So goes too in the Metro Denver region, where we recovered all of those jobs that had been lost in February 2022 and have been on a growth trend since that point in time. But let's start kind of breaking this out. Oh, and I need to give the shout out to elsewhere in Colorado. I mean, again, our urbanized areas represent 17 of our 64 counties, so those other 47 counties throughout the state of Colorado growing by 6.7%. Huge growth. Again, very variable throughout the state, but in general, very solid performance. But let's take a look at, kind of some deeper looks here. So I want you to bring your attention, first of all, to the gray bar, which is 2019, and then comparing that to 2023, which is the green bar. So what we will see here then is that 9 out of our 11 super sectors, remember all businesses out there are put into one of these buckets according to the goods, service that they provide. So 9 of our 11 super sectors have surpassed where we had been pre-COVID. So again, got that 2019 period of time, with 2 exceptions. The government sector, which includes state, local, federal government employment, still down by about 5,000 jobs compared to where we had been in 2019. And leisure and hospitality, which is kind of that middle of that chart there. Even though we have seen tremendous growth in leisure and hospitality employment, we are still below where we had been back in 2019. Now, turn your attention, let's compare those green bar with the red bar. The red bar reflects, had we grown at the perfect pace from 2019 on forward in those various industries, where should we be? And you will see that all of our super sectors are below that perfect pace, with 3 exceptions, and those are the ones that are circled in green there. Professional and business services does indeed surpass that whole perfect pace, and this is great news for us here in the Metro Denver region, because professional and business services is everything from accounting and legal services to all the architectural design, computer systems design, very broad brush of all of those business services. So as those business services are doing well, it typically means that the companies that are requesting those business services are doing well. So it's kind of one of those that represents, kind of this whole rising tide there. The other sector that is also surpassed our pre-growth trend, if you will, transportation, warehousing, and utilities. Mainly because of that whole warehousing side. Yes, think back to those early days of COVID and how you sat there at your computer and clicked away and ordered everything you could think of. off of Amazon or some other e-commerce provider. That was the big growth too, the big employment growth that happened as we have seen all of those logistics companies, all of those e-commerce companies have really, they moved close to where the population base is, and so we saw this tremendous increase in that. And then also finally, the information sector has surpassed pre-growth trends, which is amazing. This is print media, but what's really propelling it forward again is all of our more electronic media, our electronic information. Think Google. You go to Google to find information. So that also has surpassed. So all in all, it's like, well, Patty, you're painting a pretty nice picture here. Yes, we still have some growth that we have to go through. And indeed, when we take a look at our overall growth rate, our forecast is that Metro Denver will expand by 2.2%, which is a little bit below our peak, our perfect pace of 2.5%, but all in all, pretty solid. But again, digging a little deeper here, we need to recognize that if we had grown at that perfect pace, which would be that whole red line there, compared to the green line, which is where we have been and where we are projected to be, we see that we are about 95,000 jobs short in Metro Denver. And we think, does that mean our economic development community has not been doing their work? Oh, no, not at all. Rather, we have been very busy. Prospect activity is very active. The folks at Metro Denver Economic Development Corp and all of our local economic development agencies are very busy responding to client needs. But the issue has been what Elizabeth already alluded to, on the labor force side. Even if we recognize that we are 95,000 jobs short, that doesn't mean that we would be able to have that many additional jobs. We really need to rethink our long-term trends here because of the labor force constraints that we are indeed facing here, not just in Colorado. I recognize it's national, but obviously we're more concerned about what's happening here in Metro Denver and in Colorado. So again, from the unemployment rate side, then, that's the measure that everybody gleans onto in the newspapers as far as, how tight the labor market is. 3.3% unemployment rate right now, that was the December data for this state, is only good enough to rank us number 20 in the country. So as low as this whole 3.3 rate sounds, recognize we rank in the middle of the country. Our neighbor to the west, Utah, is functioning with a 2.2% unemployment rate. North Dakota, South Dakota are at 2.3% unemployment rate. It is an incredibly, incredibly tight labor market out there. And some of you I know will be thinking, well, if people would just get off the couch and get to work, life would be grand again, right? No, that's not happening here in Colorado. We have the second highest labor force participation rate in the country, and that's basically economist geek speak for what percentage of the population 16 years old and over is either working or actively seeking a job. So that's that gray line there compared to the US, which is the red line. Notice that our labor force participation rate is basically pre-COVID right now. No, it doesn't match where we had been early in 2010s there, but again, our whole composition is very different. So even if, yes, so as you're thinking, if I just sweeten that pot a little bit, I can get those additional workers to come in. Yes, to a small extent, but in general, we need to figure out how to operate with this whole more constrained labor force out there. As another demonstration of this is what is called the JOLTS data, Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, that is done for across the country for all of the states. Focus on that green bar, the dotted green line there. That is the number of job openings, and this is data as of the end of November. So as of the end of November in Colorado, we had 231,000 jobs open, posted. Now, draw your attention to the purple-ish line there. That is the number of unemployed folks. We had 114,000 unemployed people throughout the state at that same point in time. You do the math, we are 117,000 people short of filling all of those jobs. So again, going back to that idea that Metro Denver, just the subset here, short by 95,000 people, again, we need to recognize that this is a situation that is not changing. We need to change our perception of what is a perfect pace of employment growth out there, because we're just not going to make that type of pace anymore. Right, turning to the commercial real estate side, sometimes you have to take a longer term view. You sometimes have to pull back a little bit, see what everybody else is doing. I'm going to pull upon the work of Dr. Glenn Mueller at the University of Denver. He does what is called the real estate market cycle monitor. He looks at 54 different communities, different metropolitan areas across the country, looks at 5 different property types, and says where on this whole cycle are all of these various markets located. Nirvana is number 11. That's equilibrium within the market. Otherwise, in any type of commercial real estate markets, you go through a recovery phase, then you enter a whole expansionary phase. Hypersupply, meaning that perhaps you have overbuilt a little bit, and then into a recessionary type of category. You do not have to move smoothly from one point to another. You can get to a point and then retreat back to a higher point, or vice versa. But it's all based on vacancy rates, new construction activity, and various rental rates. So on the office side, taking a look at Denver compared to some of our key competitor locations across the country, Denver, Houston, Atlanta, and the nation as a whole is all considered to be in a recovery phase right now on the office market. We already went through kind of that hypersupply, that recession. Now we're starting to see perhaps a little bit of recovery very early on. So, because certainly the office market is one that was hit the hardest by this whole transitioning economy. As we have moved to remote work, as hybrid is the thing for offices these days, we have certainly seen some challenges on the whole office market side. Industrial, oh my golly, we have seen such a crazy, crazy industrial market. In the Metro Denver region, 2023 is going to be our 7th year in a row of building 5 million square feet or more of new industrial space. Again, so that we can keep ordering everything off of Amazon and get it delivered to us within 2 hours or whatever they're up to now these days. On the industrial side, though, we are now moving perhaps into a little bit of a hypersupply side, where, and as have some of our main competitors. So a little concern out there now that, yes, we needed all of that new space built. We needed to respond to the market demands, but now maybe we need to start thinking about kind of the longer term trends there. What do we need for the long term? Retail. Everybody, 54 communities across the country said to be in equilibrium. Who knew on the retail side that we would actually say we are in equilibrium? When COVID started, we thought, retail, you are doomed. No, they have been doing very, very solidly. And indeed, the retail market is really regarded as one of the best places from an investment perspective there now. Add all that square footage together in Metro Denver, as I had mentioned, we have seen incredible amounts of industrial space being added. That is the gray line in that chart. 2022, we built 9 million square feet. Again, the bulk of that was industrial. 2023, we expect that we will surpass that with about 10.8 million square feet of completions. Again, the bulk of that on the industrial side. So there's still lots of activity out there, and we still continue to hear from our construction companies that, it is hard to find the workers that are needed to keep that level of construction going. Turning to consumers, that's you and I, how we get out there, spend our dollars. How we get out there and spend our dollars drives the majority of the economy. 68% of our GDP is comprised of how you and I get out and spend our dollars. I'm seeing a little bit of a rest phase coming up. You know, in order to maintain the perfect pace, sometimes you have to take a little bit of a break. And so, you know, rest is important so you can build your strength, build your endurance. Elizabeth already did a phenomenal job, of course, of talking about the population here, but I just wanted to make a clear one point that blew me out of the water, so much so that I had to call Elizabeth's office and say, no, is this really true? In 2021, we saw the first out-migration. Again, the number of people moving into the area, less the number of people moving out of the area. We saw the first net out-migration in Metro Denver. Since going back to 2003, 2005, we saw, around 1,500 people or so moving out. This time, nearly 8,000 more people moved out of the area than moved in. We still had a growing population because of that natural increase, but it was one of the slowest paces that we have had. And you dig a little bit deeper, as Elizabeth's office told me to look, and it's like the only parts that we saw positive in migration was Broomfield County and Douglas counties. All of our other counties in Metro Denver, again, more from that had that whole net out migration. Yes, we are expected to continue to grow in the region, but as Elizabeth already had mentioned, at a much slower pace than what we have been doing. And again, taking a look, this is the funnest chart in the world. I mean, Elizabeth, when they came up with this, it was just like, it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. To take a look again at that whole, our single year of age, put them into the generational groups, and again, as is the case for Colorado, the millennials are the largest generational group right here in the Metro Denver region, and this is huge when we think about that whole influence on the housing market. And we're going to talk about that whole housing market, but this was a lot of the driver of that was what we were seeing happening within the whole millennial transitions here. The other thing influencing all of us consumers is inflation. Oh my gosh, we were just crying last year. It's like, prices keep going up, and indeed, Metro Denver prices and the U.S. prices increased by 8% then in 2022. Our expectation is that we'll continue to see tempering, and indeed, we have seen that inflation rate come down every month for about the past 6 months. 4.5% inflation expected in the U.S. In 2023, 4.8% in Metro Denver. Obviously, that does indeed influence how we are able to take our salaries, our wages, and get out there and spend those dollars. Transportation was really the start of this whole thing, because as oil and gas prices went up, it then started to permeate everything. So consumers have to play into that. They have to look at what is going on with inflation. And indeed, when we see some of the very, very high expenditure levels, we saw this whole, 16% increase in retail spending back in 2021. In 2022, we increased by 10.5%. We're expecting that we will still increase by 4.5% to 5% for 2023. But those numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So if we back it out by the inflation rates, what we are seeing is, again, that whole, what I'm calling kind of a rest period for our consumers, as consumers are still out there spending money at strong levels, but a lot of that is just being eroded by inflation right about now. Okay, wrapping it up. Residential real estate. Sometimes a change of pace is necessary. So maybe it's really no longer that we need to keep the perfect pace in residential real estate, but definitely do something kind of a change of pace. And I said that to a residential realtor group recently, and they're like, Patty, are you telling us that we should all get out of being residential realtors now? No. But definitely we need to change some expectations here. So, as we have looked, and if you are a residential realtor, I know this has been an incredibly tough period of time. We saw this whole upsurge in home sales activity in 2020 and into 2021, and then a 20% pullback in the number of homes that traded hands in 2022. Ouch, that was painful. And as we look out into 2023, we're expecting kind of this whole same pace of growth. But I would also suggest this is exactly what we need right now, because we are an expensive housing market. On our housing market, we see that the Boulder MSA is the 7th most expensive housing market in the country. The Denver MSA, no great bargain, we rank number 14. Those prices had increased at a very rapid pace. But now I am expecting that in 2023, we will see some leveling off of those prices, maybe about a 2% increase. And some people will look at this chart and be absolutely petrified, because that 2% appreciation rate that we are forecasting is below, way below our 10-year trend, way below our 20-year trend. But again, going back to that whole idea of the perfect pace, the red line reflects where our home prices should be if we had been growing at that whole perfect pace there, versus the green line reflects where we have been, and what we see is that we are $65,000 higher right now than if our prices had maintained that perfect pace. If we were to even look at a 20-year trend, it's $134,000. So this pause period is so needed. And so not only are we seeing a bit of a pullback in the demand side, again, millennials being the big concentration here, we're in a little dip of millennials right now. We have a big chunk of them coming up again in another 3 to 4 years when they hit that prime first-time home buying age in that 35, 36 range. We've been pushing that out farther and farther and farther. But so not only are we seeing a little bit of a slowdown in the demand side, but we have been increasing the supply. In Metro Denver, if we are building 17,000 units on average, that is kind of the perfect pace for us. And we have indeed been building after that. So we have indeed been adding to that supply. So again, that expectation that we will see some tempering of those prices. So there you have it. Thank you so much for your attention on this. And I just also want to say I have been so honored, so blessed to have been a part of this event for 20-odd years here. This is my farewell tour. I am going to be one of those people that is retiring that Elizabeth has talked about there. So again, thank you for inviting me into your businesses, into your lives for all of these years. Best of luck to you. Thanks so much.
You know it's real dedication from a speaker when she decides to retire just to make a point so that Elizabeth's comments are accurate. But what a blessing it's been to have you for all these years, and we wish you well. Maybe some of you who are in need of labor force could talk her out of retirement in another role, but we're just delighted. And I see our friends here from the Women's Chamber of Commerce. Simone, how are you? I hope it's not lost on you that we picked the 3 most powerful economists in Colorado, and they're all women. So good stuff, huh? We did that just for you, Simone. So Patty, thank you again. Our final presenter today is Dr. Tatiana Bailey. In the economic development field, Dr. Bailey presents nationwide on the current national, state, and local economies. Recently, Tatiana founded and serves as the executive director for Data-Driven Economic Strategies, which is based in Colorado Springs. Her company focuses on rigorous, unbiased monthly economic reporting and workforce development initiatives, particularly in underserved communities. She is a tremendous resource for both state and local governments and communities across the country, and I am delighted to welcome her to the stage. Dr. Bailey.
Thank you so much for having me here. As you can, I guess I should stop talking. I guess I should remember that it's a good thing to mention that I need a handheld. I don't usually use podiums because you may or may not see me. So I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot of great information that's already been covered, and I'm going to try to kind of pull it together for a macroeconomic picture, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the labor force. So first, I just want to say our nonprofit is all of 3 months old, which means we're very young, but really honored to have about 22 community sponsors now, including Vectra Bank, and I'm very thankful for your support. Really briefly, DDES, Data-Driven Economic Strategies, we do 2 things. We focus on economic reporting, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, and we next month are starting one for a large association in Washington, D.C. And then we do workforce development, particularly focused on underserved communities, helping high schools use labor market data. What are the high demand occupations and skills and so forth? And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a second. And then are we using that to really inform kids about what these high demand occupations are and really bolstering their career technical education programs so that sometimes they can even come out of high school with a livable wage job. And then the reports that we have, you can actually find them online on ddestrategies.org. El Paso County, Pueblo, and this is just a quick snapshot of what they look like. I think a few of them were available up front. So, big question. I have a little bit of laryngitis. This is my 6th presentation in 10 days. Is a recession coming? Everybody really wants to know. What are the key indicators that I'm watching that all economists are watching? And if we have a recession, how severe would it be? Would it be US? Would it be global? And then what is the role of labor and labor participation? I love that my other 2 co-presenters really help back me up because I have some people pushing back on me saying, no, we're going to hit a recession. All those lazy people are going to come back into the labor force. But I don't think so. And it seems like neither do you as well. And then some final thoughts. So this is kind of 30,000 foot level, but I think it's really important in terms of longer term growth. If you ask any historian, which I'm not, most of them will say that human history has had about 6 major transitions, things like nomadic to agrarian societies, industrialization and so forth. I believe we have 3 transitions happening at the same time right now globally. I believe we have a food transition because population is still increasing, but climate impacts really the ability to produce sufficient food and at an attainable cost. So let's think about that when we talk about inflation. Energy transition. Why? Because we're moving towards green energy sources, but we haven't done a great job with what about the bridge sources of energy, like natural gas? Haven't we found out the hard way? And then demographics, something that has already been talked about beautifully. But really, what does that mean longer term in terms of the sustainability, particularly of the economic growth in mature economies? I think transitions of this magnitude impact both short-term and long-term economic development. And let's remember that these transitions are happening 8 billion people on the planet. That certainly has not happened before in previous transitions. So is a recession imminent? Well, if we annualize GDP over the first couple of quarters of 2022, we did have contractions, so technically a recession, but it was never called a recession because of the labor force, right? The strength of the labor force. Overall, the numbers just came out late last week, 2022 grew at 2.1% in the United States. So not a great growth, but positive, right? What am I watching? I'm looking at inflation, yes, but deeper than that. How broad-based is it? What are the underlying factors? How volatile is it, right? Something like gasoline, how much is it going to go up and down? What is its likely end point, and for how long are we going to have to keep interest rates elevated in order to help tamp out inflation? What is the strength of the labor market? Is it going to help us, buoy us, like it did in 2022, or is it going to soften enough so that we have a recession? What about manufacturing? A lot of people say, oh, we're more of a services economy now. Manufacturing, does it really tell us that much? Absolutely. It is a huge leading indicator. What about the surveys, business and consumer surveys? I really look at those because that's boots on the ground. Households know how much they're spending. They're watching prices. Businesses, same thing. They know how hard it is to get labor and what they're paying for their input costs. What about the savings rate? That's your cushion, right? Yield curve, that infamous yield curve, the stock market. What about the reopening of China? Is that a pro or a con? And how is COVID maybe going to continue to impact that? And then global geopolitical conditions. Those last two I'm not going to talk about a lot, but that really tells you how volatile things are, how sort of unpredictable more so than usual. So here's the chart on GDP growth that I already talked about. But if you look at this, the forecast for 2023 by the Conference Board, which is the one that I look at most closely, I like that one because it amalgamates a whole bunch of different things like the manufacturing survey, like the unemployment rate, unemployment claims, and so forth, meshes them together and then predicts. They are actually predicting a 0.2% growth rate for 2023, so pretty anemic for the U.S. And the new one comes out in a few days. It might be revised upward a little bit, but I'm pretty much in that camp of pretty anemic growth for this year. Now, JP Morgan and Wells Fargo are 0.8 and 1% growth rate, so they're a bit more bullish if you call it that. Now, they are saying that we're going to rebound to a 1.7% growth rate in 2024, but a recession is going to start sometime this year, probably early, and end around Q3. And why? Big one, of course. It's mostly because of inflation and the elevated interest rates that we have to have. And they're saying that the target of 2%, we're going to be beyond that at about 3.5% for the remainder of this year. So this pivot that the stock market thinks is going to happen doesn't seem really likely according to most economists. The other interesting thing is that they are forecasting stagflation. What is that? That's when you have inflation alongside little to no growth. And 57% of the World Economic Forum that happened in Davos economists agree. They're also saying that unemployment will increase some, but it's still going to be a relatively tight labor market, like we've talked about. And then that it'll peak around 4.5% and then overall be about 4%. But think about this for a second. Even if it goes up to 5%, what is the natural rate of unemployment by most economists? 4.5%. So still incredibly low. Now, the other thing I look at for the Conference Board is the LEI, the Leading Economic Index. Look at the quote up there on your right. The LEI fell sharply again in December, continuing to signal recession for the U.S. economy in the near term. I really paid attention to that. It's a little hard to see, but you see the red dotted line where I have the arrow? That's the threshold that when the LEI goes below that, it signals recession. And if you look back, it's been doing that for decades. It's an excellent predictor, sometimes happening almost in real time and sometimes just a few months before. And then on the bottom right, you can see the 10th consecutive decline in the LEI was worse than expected, but the labor components still kept it a little bit higher. So labor is still helping us out to some extent. Now, Colorado is actually forecasted by most economists in the state to do a little bit better. So let's just say if we do end up at 0.2, Colorado GSP, gross state product, will be about 0.5%, and that's pretty much indicative of what's happened over many years. We outperformed the nation. All right, what are the other economic metrics that I am watching to help with forecasting the future? I love this. Jim looks at the mirror and he says, from time to time, I send Dwight faxes from himself from the future. Okay, so CPI, 6.5%. Still historically really high if you look back. Hasn't been this high since the 1980s, but it's coming down. The question is, how fast is it going to come down? So this is amalgamation here of what are the major components of increase or decrease. Well, in December, we had a decrease in gasoline and used cars and trucks, and that's the main reason that inflation cooled. So remember, now I'm digging under the hood, trying to figure out why inflation is either going up or going down. The other components are huge increases over the past 12 months, but a slowing rate of increase. The thing that I watch, though, is that these are the components that make up the typical household budget, right? Transportation, cars, food, shelter, and so forth. So that means that most people are getting hit pretty hard in their pocketbooks. And this also means that inflation has been elevated enough that even with some of the double-digit increases we saw in some industries during the pandemic in terms of wages, real earnings are still down 1.7%. And then, of course, you can see here, interest rates are that much higher, right? We haven't had inflation increases this fast in 3 decades. Probably means we're going to have 2 more Fed hikes, one tomorrow for 25 basis points, and then another one in March. And most people think we're going to hold there. Now, what about the surveys I talked about? So the leading indicator, 48.4%. Anything under 50 means that the manufacturing sector is contracting. What I really pay attention to here are the new orders, which are well below 50 at 45.2%, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But they're also saying employment is still positive. And inventories are also still elevated because of sort of over-ordering, if you will, because of the pandemic. But the major thing is employment. Skilled labor is still in high demand. So another thing that I am watching closely. And then those new orders that I talked about, kind of like the LEI chart that I showed you, look at the little red arrows there. You can see that monthly increases in the new orders often fall just before or at the very beginning of a recession. Over the past 20 years, new orders have never fallen below 50 without a recession ensuing. Oh, that's another indicator. All right, and then what about the business survey? Well, the long-term average for the National Federation of Independent Businesses is around 98. And the latest reading in December was 89.8. Why? Well, inflation is still the #1 concern of businesses around the country. 44% of them have had to increase compensation. The long-term average is 23%. That tells me wage inflation might be slowing, but it's still pretty strong. And absolutely, it has a lot to do with demographics. 17% plan to create new jobs. 41% of owners could not fill job openings. 93% of those reported few or no qualified applicants for open positions. Now, 43% are still raising prices, so that's pretty high, but it is slowing, so that's good. University of Michigan, my alma mater. I know I don't look like it, but I'm a Wolverine. You can see here, 64.9. Now, it's improved a little bit over the last few months, but look at how low that is, and go over to the Great Recession of 2008. We actually fell a little bit lower. How can that possibly be? All about inflation. That low point right there, that was June when gas prices were particularly high. No great surprise with interest rates higher and confidence low. It is not a good time to buy, according to consumers, for homes, large household goods, or vehicles. And those are things that require often financing, and the higher interest rates will impact that. Now, savings rates. I look closely at this because this is the cushion, right? Pre-pandemic savings were at 9.1%, and in December we were at 3.4%. So no great surprise that revolving credit over on your bottom right is increasing. People are having to take out more credit, use credit cards and so forth, and that's most likely because of inflation and real wages not really keeping pace. Now, delinquencies so far are not up, but another thing that I am concerned about with this increased use of credit is simply that with the higher interest rates, that means, for instance, the prime lending rate is also higher, right? So people are paying more in interest as well. And then what about this infamous yield curve? Well, you can see that it's also a pretty good predictor of recessions, or at least pretty stark contractions. The red arrows show you that we have an inversion, a positively sloping curve just before or at the very beginning of a recession. Since 1956, yield curve inversions have preceded recessions, typically by 12 months. Now, the first inversion happened in October, so according to this measure, we wouldn't see a recession until later this year. Now, of course, S&P 500, we've seen this huge rally after the first parts of the pandemic, and now we've seen some adjustment. But take a look at 2021, the S&P moving average annual change, 31% appreciation. And then the correction, if you will, of -3% overall, we may still have a little bit more of a correction ahead of us, especially if we have this contraction, which all indicators are pointing us in. I will tell you, too, that some economists say housing and manufacturing are already in a recession. What about the labor market? Okay, so here you can see the unemployment rate incredibly low, not seasonally adjusted, 3.3% in the US, and forecasted to stay in that 4% range, both for the US and Colorado. Well, that 3.3% unemployment rate, that is the lowest we've had since 1969. Think about that for a second. Now, it's as low as it is partially because we have a lot of people not participating in the labor force, and that's a big problem. So if we have 5.7 million unemployed and 5.2 million not actively participating, that's 10.9 million sort of or underutilized workers in the US. And the red line is the civilian participation rate that Patty brought up. Most of the unemployed are indeed young, but they are also the ones who are actively looking for work or working. So that's a very important concept to keep in mind as well. I always like to also think about, okay, well, why is the labor participation rate so low and how does that compare to other countries? You can see the black line is the US. Ours has actually been falling for prime working ages 25 to 54, whereas Germany, Canada, UK, and Australia have actually been increasing. And it's not forecasted to get any better, largely because of demographics. You can see that the bars, the gray bar, shows labor participation by age group by 2031. Things are not going to get any better. And that also tells me that the labor market's going to stay tight and that we're going to continue to have some wage inflation. So why do we have a shortage of bodies with 10.5 million job openings and only 5.7 million unemployed? Aging, we talked about that. Today, one in 7 people in the US is 65 plus. By 2030, it'll be 1 in 5. 1 million fewer children in 2010 compared to 2020. Childcare. We lost 160,000 childcare workers 2019 to 2020. We've recovered some of that, but we're still down 72,000. We've had a troubling decline in the male labor participation rate. That's the one thing I'm going to dig into a little bit more. Less international immigration, and that is primarily the laws that were changed in 2017. We used to have about 2 million coming into the United States, and we're now at about 260,000. Now, this is a good thing. We do also have more self-employed people. Okay, so I just want to pause here for a second, and I'd like to say my husband and I had 5 kids, so we are incredible economic developers. At the time, people thought we were absolutely crazy to have that many. But as you can see there, with each child, there's been a concomitant increase in real GDP, although I'll tell you that some of them contributed to GDP more than others, I'm just going to say. All right, so what about this male labor participation rate? Well, in 2008, When it was already lower than it had been in previous years, the male labor participation rate was about 73%, and now it's about 68%. How can that be? Why? Fewer manufacturing jobs. I think we know that story in the 1960s. We know that a lot of the prime working age men today, 35 to 44, they entered the labor force during the Great Recession. They either had trouble finding a job or lost their jobs. For those who did get back into the labor force, a lot of them, particularly the uneducated, really had a tough time because of the pandemic, right? Because then they lost their jobs again. There are some shifting norms. This is not my area of expertise, but it used to be women stayed home with the children, and men, were head of household and the providers, and those norms have changed. Higher, actually, post-secondary education enrollment now for women. In the 1990s, we had a war on crime and a lot of incarceration, and when those men came out, it was more difficult for them to find a job. And then, of course, the higher cost of higher education is very difficult for a lot of people to pay for and makes it more difficult for them to get some of the skills that they need. Now, look at the bottom right there. In 1950, 1 in 50 men, prime working ages, did not participate in the labor force. Today, it's 1 in 9. I think that this is also an important thing too, and I hear this a lot, particularly from younger people, is that wealth inequality has also kind of changed the perceptions of work. If we look at the top 1% in terms of wealth in the United States, they have about 31% of the total wealth. The top 1% have 31% of the wealth. The bottom 50% have about 3% of the total wealth. And a lot of social scientists say that that is much of the reason that we have the polarization that we do as well. Now, the self-employed is something I also mentioned, and I actually really like this. We have over 1 million more people reporting that they are self-employed or have their own business from 2016 to 2022. And remember, those are people reporting. Not everyone is always reporting that they have a business. And of course, I just want to mention quickly too that self-employment is often the seed for innovation. Skills gap is an important thing to remember because obviously we need every worker we can get, so let's make sure we train them with the relevant skills. So job openings are clearly not the problem. Yes, they are coming down a little bit, but if you look at the trend line historically, they're still elevated. And if you look at the surveys from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a lot of the non-participants basically say that they just don't have the skill set that they need in order to participate in the labor force. The job openings we have are across a plethora of industries. It's not concentrated in one or two, it's across many. Job openings are up 45% in November of last year compared to April of 2019. You can see that the labor market is incredibly tight with about 0.5 workers for each job opening. And then I think this is really important. This is what some of my the work that my nonprofit does. What are the top 10 job openings? Why aren't we showing this to kids? How much do you make on average? What is the projected growth for that occupation between now and 2028? And according to my source, we have about 155,000 job openings in the state of Colorado over the last 30 days. I think this is really important too. Let's look at, if I pull that list a little longer, what are the trends? The job openings tend to be in healthcare, no great surprise, professional and non-professional. Information technology, I think that's not a surprise, a lot of IT, hospitality, truck drivers, auto repair. We usually have a lot in the construction and trades, and that'll definitely be back because we have a shortage of housing. Then we have this thing called the barbell economy, which a lot of economists talk about. We have most of our openings are high school or vocational and bachelor's degrees. So there are still, there is still a lot of demand for both of these. And then if you dig a little deeper looking at labor market, well, what are some of the software skills that are in greatest demand? And that's what you see in front of you. Yes, it's things like Microsoft Excel and so forth, but it's also a lot of programming that doesn't always require a 4-year degree, like Python, SQL, and so forth. And then the certificates on your bottom left there, you can see medical, teachers, project management, and so forth. And then I think this is important. Think about some of the common sense solutions. Like, it's a little hard to see, but in the bottom left, you can see in Colorado Springs, in 2017, I looked at something like nursing assistants. We had about 1,500 job openings in 2017, but we only trained 95. Why is there such a big chasm, and how can we fix that? And then, of course, exacerbating this are the higher costs of education. It was alluded to earlier. You can see that in the United States, someone who goes to a four-year university that's public pays about 42% of that tuition. In Colorado, it's higher. We're actually more expensive, even though we need more workers. So that's something to pay attention to. Student loans are a huge problem, and of course, they impact home ownership. We have 1.75 trillion in student debt, which is more than credit card, only second to mortgage. The average student loan is $37,000, $55,000 for Black borrowers, and about 70% of college grads have student loans. Completion is a problem. 50% of university-level students who start a program do not finish by the end of their 6th year. A lot of times they have the debt and not the degree. And this is obviously attributable to costs, academic readiness, and some of the income inequality that we talked about. And then, just starting to wrap up here, Housing Opportunity Index. I mentioned something about home ownership. Look at, for instance, Colorado Springs, where I live. We had a Housing Opportunity Index before of 71.4, and now we're down to 24.9. What does that mean? That means that now 25% of the houses that are bought in our region are affordable to the median household income. That's really low. That's clearly unaffordable. But I'd like to say that overall, despite all the dark news that I've given you, I am overall bullish for Colorado. Moved here 8.5 years ago, and this is a lot of the reason I brought my family here. We have slowing population, but we still have population growth. All my kids were born in Michigan, University of Michigan, but Rust Belt is really losing population. A lot of those states are, particularly Ohio, because they're my nemesis, Ohio State. And we are also primarily educated and young, right? Future workforce, if we can keep them. We are benefiting from the migration away from the Midwest and the Northeast and portions of the South. We have a diversity of sectors. This is fantastic, with a lot of innovation, professional and technical, which was mentioned, business startups, and federal government, with DOD in particular. We have one of the highest labor participation rates. But I think if we look forward, if we want to continue to really thrive, we have to be proactive with our current and future training, educating our workforce. We have to be really, really proactive with affordable housing. We have to address homelessness, and we have to be proactive with sustainable water policies. And I'd like to say that I think we can distinguish ourselves as an independent, politically independent state that plans ahead in order to ensure robust and sustainable economic growth. And a lot of that, of course, is planning ahead and looking at these trends. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain is full. That was a lot to think about. We are at 1 o'clock, so I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I would ask that later on today, you're going to get a survey in your email, and if you could fill that out for us so we make sure that our programming is relevant in years to come, and whether you like this noon time versus a morning time, that would be great. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and not open it up to questions for everybody, because we've gotten a ton of questions that have come through already. And I'm going to ask two, and then I'm going to let you all go back to work, okay? The first question for all three of you is that with this low unemployment rate and with labor force challenges that we have, what is that going to do to wages? And if wages grow as a function of those shortages, what does that mean for inflation, and what does it mean relative to what the Fed is going to do? Tatiana, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So I think because of everything that we've talked about with demographics, I think wage inflation is going to be a problem. And you remember I talked about the three transitions, the last one being demographics. I think part of the reason that we're going to struggle a little bit, and there may be stagflation moving forward, is because of wages and because of the demographic challenges that we have. Now, this morning, I believe it is, the Employment Cost Index came out, the ECI, and that's the Fed's preferred measure for what's happening with wages. It's still increasing. I believe it increased 1%, and that was considered, wow, wonderful, because it's been increasing more than that previously. So again, the rate of growth in wages is slowing, but it's not negative. Wages are really sticky, right? So you have two things. First of all, if any of you are business owners, if you want to keep your employees, you're not going to say, hey, things are getting a little bit better, so I'm going to cut your pay. That's not going to happen, right? And secondly, when you think about all the demographics that we're talking about, that employer knows that it's going to be pretty difficult to attract anyone new. So I believe that this is going to be a headwind that we're going to have for a long time to come. And part of the reason, economists and demographers talk so much about migration, we've benefited from that for so long. I think we can be proactive about who do we want to attract. I didn't have the chart, but I typically show there's really only one region in the world between now and 2050 that's going to have significant population growth, and that's Africa. Europe is declining. The United States is growing at a much slower pace, barely at all, and that's true for a lot of regions. So why don't we look at how we can bring people legally into the country to fill some of the lowest and highest skilled jobs, because that's typically what they've done.
And I think that whole issue of wage inflation is interesting because it makes it harder for all of us as employers, but it will start to address that income inequality gap, which is a critical issue, I think, for our country. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Just one thing that I would add, yes, wages. I mean, here in Colorado, we know that our average wage is typically higher. I mean, that's certainly one of the issues that we face in the economic development world, is that we are regarded as a higher cost state from the wage side and everything. What I've been encouraging employers to do is to look beyond the wages, though, too, in that whole business attraction, business retention side, what can be done as an employer to sweeten the pot without putting things into that whole bottom line? Because, once wages go up, they do not come back down. Are there ways then to allow more remote work, make it more attractive? Are there ways to sweeten some of the days off, the benefits packages, what have you, so that we're not, even though those items do indeed cost employers something, you can still, they can be manipulated or changed a little easier. So really trying to take a look at that in that whole game for employers. And just to be thinking about, too, how to do more with fewer people. And in some cases, that may be some type of technology enhancements, and others, it's, I don't know. But to get creative, right now, they're figuring out how to build houses in a very short period of time because they're doing it in the factory. For years we've talked about that the industry that wasn't changing was residential construction, and there are major changes in how we are doing that can also influence those prices and influence wages. So we have to get creative now.
That's great. Thank you. Elizabeth, anything you'd want to add?
No, just to add on to what Patty was saying, I think the key ones are looking at those non-wage components, and that we've seen that, and we're seeing people doing that. Looking at broadening the base, so looking at who aren't we including into the labor force. So, for example, people with disabilities and people maybe formerly incarcerated. So trying to broaden the base in terms of looking at who else we can bring in to the labor force besides just raising wages. But that Colorado faces a headwind on that piece, that we're unlikely to continue to be able to attract and retain if we don't increase the price, because our costs of living are so much higher than a lot of places. So I think there's hope, but there's challenges.
Okay, last question. Somebody asked the question, if you had $1 million and you were going to invest it, what would you invest it in for 1 year, 5 year, and 10 years? I think they were thinking about the stock market or the bond markets. I'm going to change the question, prerogative of the moderator, and I'm going to ask if you had $10 million and you could invest it in not necessarily the markets, but in anything else about what you spoke of today, where would you put your investment as you contemplate the future of our economy?
You want me to start?
Whatever, if you're ready.
Okay. You know, I showed you the chart for S&P. It is probably still overvalued in aggregate. And even if it's not going to, have the double-digit gains anytime really soon in the short term. And then you look at the demographics, and you look at, the fact that some states are gaining population and some are losing. I think investing in real estate for the longer haul makes an awful lot of sense. To me, that just intuitively with the numbers backing it up. So that would be one of the first places that I would look. But I'll let my colleagues go as well.
Elizabeth, are you ready?
Yeah, so I do demographics. I don't do investment.
And by the way, I meant residential real estate, not so much commercial. That's another story.
But I think if we're thinking about what we're going to invest in, I know this sounds like maybe a bad word, but definitely automation. The long run, we're going to have challenges with labor force. And so if we can look at automating the skill sets that are easily automated and then put people into higher wage, higher skilled areas, I think that's going to be a win-win. Looking also at how do we do a much better job of making sure that every person is incredibly ready for the future. So, people hear about this slowing population growth for the youngins, and they're like, oh, cool, we don't have to invest as much in K-12. And I'm like, no. We need to maybe invest more in K-12 because we need every single one of them to do a better job and be able to be super productive in the future.
That's great. Patty, you close it up on your swan song, right?
Infrastructure. I think, here in Colorado to maintain our quality of life, to maintain our attractiveness, we need to be able to get people from one point to another in a way that doesn't leave you pulling your hair out. Whether that's rail, whether that's, some type of rapid transit, whether it's more roads, I think it's, just as we've talked about, balancing energy needs in the state, we need to balance infrastructure needs in the state. And $10 million is probably only a little drop in the bucket for what we need, but it's a start.
Okay, I'll take you to 100 million and we'll get there, right?
Cool. Yay.
So we are at time. We do have a number of questions. If you want to come up and speak to the speakers afterwards, that would be great. Somebody lost their phone. If somebody lost their phone, Dave has it in the back. So if some of you are panicking because you lost it. I would like to thank our speakers again. I think this has been one of the most valuable, productive sessions I've seen in a long time. So please thank our speakers for us one more time. And as I always say, I also want to thank those of you who are customers. We so appreciate your business, your partnership. This is a relationship business. For those of you who are not yet customers, we look forward to serving you in the future. And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.